Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty massive, the Battle of the Atlantic.
Absolutely a fascinating and often overlooked part of World War II.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people have kind of a vague idea about, but you've given us some great resources here to really dig into it.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that this battle was absolutely crucial to the Allied victory.
Okay, so let's set the scene for our listeners.
Yeah.
Why was the Atlantic Ocean so vital during World War II?
Well, you have to remember that back then, air travel wasn't really a thing for transporting large amounts of goods.
Right, it was all about ships.
Exactly. Ships were the lifeline between North America and Great Britain. Everything Britain needed to fight the war, food, fuel, raw materials, it all had to come across the Atlantic.
And we're not talking about small amounts here, are we?
Not at all. Britain was incredibly dependent on these shipments. We're talking about a staggering 47 million tons of imports per year.
47 million tons. That's mind-boggling.
It is, and that's where the danger comes in. Germany knew how vulnerable Britain was. They knew that if they could cut off those supplies, they could cripple the British war effort.
So that's where the U-boats enter the picture.
Precisely, the U-boats, those German submarines, were the weapon of choice for disrupting Allied shipping.
Okay, I gotta admit, even just thinking about being on a cargo ship in the middle of the Atlantic with those U-boats lurking around gives me the chills.
I can imagine. Those U-boats were designed to be silent hunters, incredibly effective at what they did. Their goal was to sink as many Allied ships as possible to disrupt that flow of vital supplies.
And they didn't just operate randomly, right? They had a strategy.
Oh, absolutely. They often hunted in groups called wolf packs. Imagine a coordinated attack by multiple submarines. It was terrifying for the crews of the Allied ships.
You mentioned Allied ships and you keep saying convoys. Can you explain what those were?
Sure, a convoy was basically a large group of merchant ships, sometimes dozens of them, all sailing together for protection.
Safety in numbers kind of thing.
Exactly. The idea was that by traveling together, they could increase their chances of survival. They'd also have warships escorting them for protection.
Okay, but wouldn't that make them a giant target for those wolf packs?
It did make them a target, but it was also their best defense. The logic was that it was better to have a concentrated force that could fight back rather than having individual ships scattered all over the Atlantic.
It must have been a logistical nightmare trying to organize and protect those convoys.
Oh, it was. It involved incredible coordination and planning on a massive scale, but it was absolutely essential to the Allied war effort.
So we've got this picture of the Atlantic as this vital lifeline and these U-boats trying to sever it. Where does Canada fit into all of this? I mean, we weren't exactly a naval superpower at the time.
That's true. Canada's Navy was quite small at the start of the war, just a handful of destroyers and a few thousand personnel. But when the call came, they stepped up in a big way.
In what way?
Well, for one, they launched a massive shipbuilding effort. They focused on building smaller, faster warships called corvettes.
Corvettes. I'm not that familiar with those. What were they like?
Think of them as the little brother of the destroyer. They were about half the size and not as heavily armed, but they were quick, inexpensive to build, and perfect for anti-submarine warfare.
So they were tailor-made for taking on the U-boats?
You could say that. And Canada's geographical location also made them a crucial player in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Right, because we're right on the edge of that Atlantic battlefield.
Exactly. Canada was essentially on the front lines of this battle, building ships, protecting convoys, and playing a vital role in keeping those supply lines open.
Okay, so we've got a sense of the scale and importance of the Atlantic as a supply route, the dangers posed by those lurking U-boats, and how Canada was stepping up to meet the challenge. So where do we go from here? What were some of the key turning points in this battle? Did the corvettes and the Canadians manage to turn the tide?
They certainly did, but it wasn't easy. It was a long and hard-fought battle, with many twists and turns along the way.
Well, I can't wait to hear about it. What happened next?
Let's dive into that right now. One of the most crucial developments, well, one of the biggest factors was the advancements the Allies made in technology and intelligent things like radar and sonar started to give them an edge.
So the U-boats couldn't just disappear into the depths so easily anymore.
Exactly. Those technological advancements made a huge difference. The development of long-range aircraft also played a key role.
Because it extended the area where those convoys had air cover.
Right? Precisely, that dreaded black pit we talked about started to shrink as the Allies developed aircraft that could patrol further out into the Atlantic.
Making it a lot riskier for those U-boats to operate.
Absolutely. And then there was the breaking of the German Enigma code.
Oh, wow, yeah, the Enigma code that was supposed to be unbreakable.
Right, but the Allies managed to crack it, and that gave them access to a treasure trove of intelligence about U-boat movements.
So they could anticipate attacks and even set traps for those wolf packs.
Exactly. It was a game changer.
So this combination of technology intelligence and the sheer determination of the Allied forces, including those Canadian corvettes, started to turn the tide.
Yes, it was a turning point, but it was still a fierce and dangerous battle. Let me tell you about the story of HMCS St. Croix.
Okay, what happened to the St. Croix?
Now, she was a Canadian destroyer escorting a convoy when she was hit by not one, but two acoustic torpedoes fired by a U-boat.
Acoustic torpedoes. I don't think I've heard of those. What are they?
They were a new type of torpedo developed by the Germans. Instead of following a straight path, they were guided by sound. They homed in on the noise of a ship's propellers.
Oh, wow, that must have made them incredibly difficult to evade.
It did. In the case of the St. Croix, 81 of the 148 crew members survived the initial attack, but then they faced hours in the freezing Atlantic waters.
Oh, man. I can't imagine how terrifying and cold that must have been.
It was a desperate situation. They were eventually rescued by a British warship, HMS Itchen.
So at least it's a happy ending, right?
Well, not quite. Tragically, just 2 days later, the Itchen itself was attacked and sunk by a U-boat with the St. Croix survivors on board.
Oh, no. What a terrible twist of fate. Were there any survivors from the St. Croix after that second sinking?
Sadly, only one crew member from HMCS St. Croix survived both sinkings.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this battle.
It is behind those technological advancements and strategic maneuvers. There were real people risking their lives.
And even as the Allies were gaining an advantage, the threat from the U-boats didn't go away.
No, the Germans were constantly developing new technology like those acoustic torpedoes, always trying to find ways to counter the Allies' advancement.
The pressure was still on.
Absolutely. But Canada continued to rise to the challenge. Their role in the Battle of the Atlantic actually expanded significantly.
Yeah, in what way?
Well, in recognition of their expertise and contributions, the Allies gave Canada control of a huge portion of the North Atlantic.
Wow, how much are we talking about here?
From Nova Scotia all the way to the Arctic Circle, it was a massive area of responsibility.
That's incredible. From a small navy at the start of the war to being responsible for such a vast area of the Atlantic.
It's a testament to how crucial Canada had become in this battle. And to lead this effort, they appointed a Canadian Rear Admiral Leonard Murray as commander-in-chief of this region.
So a Canadian was in charge of a major part of the Allied war effort in the Atlantic.
He was, in fact, the only Canadian to command an entire Allied theater of war in World War II.
So by the end of the war, Canada was a major player in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Without a doubt, their contributions were vital to the Allied victory.
It's amazing to think how much their role expanded over the course of the war. But we can't forget about the cost of this victory. Thousands of lives were lost.
You're right, over 72,000 Allied personnel died in the Battle of the Atlantic, and over 3,600 of those were Canadians.
It's important to remember that each of those numbers represents a real person, a life cut short by the horrors of war.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the grand strategies and the technological innovations, but the human cost of this battle was immense.
And those who fought and died in the Battle of the Atlantic deserve to be remembered.
There are memorials dedicated to them, including the Halifax Memorial, which commemorates those lost at sea whose graves are unknown.
It's a reminder that this battle, while often overshadowed by the land battles of World War II, was absolutely crucial to the Allied victory.
The Battle of the Atlantic was truly a pivotal moment in history. It was a struggle for survival, a battle for the very lifeline of the Allied war effort.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, what if things had gone differently out there in the Atlantic?
It does, doesn't it? I mean, the Battle of the Atlantic was a really close-run thing for a long time.
You know, it's interesting to me how this battle, even though it was so important, often gets kind of overshadowed by the big land battles of World War II.
Yeah, it's true. It's sometimes called the Forgotten Battle, even though it was the longest battle of the entire war.
It's almost like because it was fought out on the ocean far away from the main population centers, it didn't get the same attention.
Right out of sight, out of mind, I guess, but those supply lines were absolutely crucial.
The lifeblood of the Allied war effort.
Exactly. Without that constant flow of supplies across the Atlantic, the Allies would have really struggled to keep up the fight in Europe.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think what might have happened if those U-boats had been more successful.
Yeah, imagine if they had managed to cut those supply lines completely.
might have been forced to make peace with Germany.
It's a scary thought. The whole course of the war could have been different.
And the world today would probably be a very different place.
Absolutely. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Battle of the Atlantic had a huge impact on the outcome of World War II and on the world we live in today.
Well, this has been a real eye-opener for me. I knew a bit about the Battle of the Atlantic before, but you've really brought it to life with all those details and stories.
It's been my pleasure. It's a fascinating and important piece of history that deserves to be remembered.